Thank you all for coming. Feels quite odd to be formal with 6 people, but we're videotaping, so we will make a production out of it nonetheless. It's a bit of a tough topic that we're playing with today, and I'll start with just a disclaimer. Well, Laura and I are both doing this, and I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then Laura will give us some theological and what the great thinkers of the church throughout history have thought and written about suffering. And then I'll come back and share a little bit about some practical applications and how we interact with suffering, maybe in our own lives, but also in the lives of others. But let me pray first. Father, what is it with suffering? Would you teach us? Would you transcend our mental processes, our knowledge, our understanding, and birth within us something deep. Teach us in suffering. Give us patience. Amen. I've been wanting to talk on this topic for some time. Not necessarily because I have anything worthwhile to say, but it's been in my mind for a while. And partly because suffering is ever before us. It's all around us. If you do not live in chronic pain, mentally or emotionally, physically, then probably someone you love does. I was just looking at the table I was eating at. Forgive me if I can. Eric's grandma just passed away this week. Tom's whole family was deathly sick this week. She's experienced it with her husband. And Laura with adoption, children. Suffering is ever before us. I wonder why we're surprised by suffering. If you look at the natural world, God's other creations, the created order, it's full of suffering. The question of why is there suffering? Why is there pain? I wonder if maybe that's not a very helpful question. I wonder if the real question is why do we feel entitled to live without suffering? Why are we surprised with suffering? I mean, all creation echoes this life from death narrative, the Jesus narrative. All creation is filled with suffering. Something is being born, something is dying. I mean, even if you look at your plates, everything on your plate is the result of some sort of death. Not just the meat, but the vegetables. Once alive and now they're dead. Life and death. It's kind of depressing in a way, isn't it? Now I know what I'm eating death. There's something that's quite encouraging to me in that, is it's the Jesus story. We find life from death. So this idea of suffering ever being before us. I wondered if you could think for a moment about the characteristics in your personality, the character traits that you have that you value most. So whether that be patience, kindness, empathy, strength, courage, I don't know what it is for you. But I would venture to guess that whatever those characteristics that you value most about yourself are born out of suffering. That they're the result of deep suffering. That suffering bursts within us something significant, something very, very helpful in the transformation of who we are. The born out of those fires is something incredible. Now, the point of life, in our life here, is to become people able to respond to life as Jesus would if he were to live our lives. People who love God and love others well. And suffering may just be one of the greatest tools in that process. And if when we get to heaven, we're actually people who want to be there. People able to enjoy God's presence, enjoy love. Suffering may just be one of the greatest tools we have in getting us to that process. So, the question then for me is really, why do we feel entitled to a life without suffering? Why are we afraid to suffer? If we really understood its redemptive processes and its capacity to help form something deep within us, we might want to befriend suffering. We might not want to be afraid of it. We might want to look at it as our teacher, however painful that is. So, I don't mean to disappoint you, but in one sense, Laura and I have no answers. When we began to start this out, I told her, I said, I've got some ideas to play with, but you answer the real questions. And she says, well, I don't have any answers for that. So I will apologize up front for that. But essentially what we'll do is Laura will go through some of the great thinkers and some ideas and quotes, biblically and other, and then I'll come back and share some practical examples of the way that we can embrace suffering as a friend, and then the pinnacle, I think, of the human experience, entering into others' suffering, being with others in their suffering. So, Laura.
Okay. Nate and I also agreed that if you were looking for an answer today, you should probably just take your buck lunch and find your way out, because we don't have that today. If we look at Scripture in the Gospels, it's pretty clear. In John, it's spelled out. In this world, you're going to have trouble. So that kind of lays it out there. It's not a surprise to you. I appreciate the ending of the passage there where it says, take heart, I've overcome the world. So we're going to have the problems, but we're not left there. We're not abandoned. So the question kind of becomes, so then where does pain and suffering enter into the equation? Because if we look at Genesis, at the end of all of those days of creation, God proclaims it good. God doesn't speak of brokenness. God doesn't speak of pain. We get the word good. So then where does it enter into the equation? Ted Vital, as he researched John Wesley's theology, says God made the world good, but suffering enters the world because of evil. And evil enters the world because of free choice, or free will choice. So it starts this dichotomy where we have a world with love and evil, and in many of our hearts that's difficult to reconcile. How can those two be compatible? How can they exist side by side? How can a God of love allow evil to be part of the equation? Lee Strobel served as pastor of Little Creek for 13 years and then moved on and has furthered his career in apologetics. So this is a little bit more of a pastoral approach. He says love always involves a choice. We human beings have abused our free will by rejecting God and walking away from him. The result has been evil entering the world and bringing pain and suffering by the wrong moral choices people make. The other type of evil is natural evil, such as disasters. This can seem like a pretty simplistic answer to a complex question. Wesley elaborates a little bit on the three types of suffering. He says there's natural suffering, where people suffer because of disease and natural disaster, where just the order of things plays out. There's moral suffering, where people suffer because others harm them. penal suffering, where people suffer because they're punished for wrongdoing. So that makes sense that we can separate suffering into those same categories. John Wesley also articulates that one could say that without the fall, Jesus wouldn't have been necessary, which prompts an interesting question. It goes back to Nate's comment, when we get to heaven, will we really want to be there? So what is this relationship? What is this place where we need Jesus, and why does it become significant? We would have been content on our own with mediocre lives. And so what Wesley is alluding to here is that God wants more for us than our simple mediocre lives. And that God's power, God's glory, God's love could only be manifested effectively through the process of the fall and redemption. If we think about an image of a playground, Wesley's idea is that God sets up the boundaries of the playground. So God sets up the fence. So there's some parameters in place, but within that playground, the children have free will. They can play and make their own decisions. And so in making their own decisions, free will played out, choices were made, and evil entered into the equation. John Calvin counters that a bit. And I liken John Calvin's view more to gym class. In gym class, the children are playing, but they're guided by an instructor. We're going to play this game with these rules and this set of boundaries. And so there's a lot more intentional control. John Calvin says God was completely intentional in allowing free will into the plan, because to allow any appearance of humanity being in control would negate the omnipotence of God. So Calvin's perspective is much more cautious about making sure that God has control of the details, where Wesley was comfortable allowing the children on the playground to play. It brings to light another question: how intentional was the fall? Did God plan for the fall? Did God know it was going to happen? How much forethought was put into that? And that's not a simple question to answer. C.S. Lewis says God gets our attention through suffering because we are humble and no longer self-sufficient. The theologian Peter Kreeft says the answer to pain and suffering must be a someone, because the problem here is understanding a someone, God. Why does he intervene or not? He talks about how in Jesus' coming, Jesus changes the meaning of death. Death is no longer the end, but death is a possibility or a new beginning. Martin Luther says, it is God's nature to make something out of nothing. Hence, one who is not yet nothing, out of him God cannot make anything. Therefore, God accepts only the forsaken, cures only the sick, gives sight only to the blind, restores life only to the dead, sanctifies only the sinners, gives wisdom only to the unwise. In short, he has mercy only on those who are wretched. Martin Luther is trying to articulate that we needed to need God. That need had to become evident to us so that there would be reason for us to pursue that relationship. Widstrom says when God reached a decision, he wanted to create humankind. He wanted humankind to experience this greatest value in the universe, which is the value of love. Well, the only way we can experience and express love is if we have the free will to love or not to love. He goes on taking a more pastoral stance in this comment. When someone is raising this issue with me, and I know they are coming from that perspective, someone presently going through pain and suffering, I know that they really don't want the long intellectual answer about why God allows pain and suffering. When you are in the midst of suffering, you are looking for someone to be Jesus to you. You are looking for someone to love you and help take care of you and reach out to you. Jen Hatmaker is a popular Christian blogger. She blogs on a number of different topics. She comments here, Job has suffered in ways incomprehensible, leaving a wake of crushing confusion. God tells us it was Satan. Job tells us it was God. His friends tell Job it was him. The finger pointing is insatiable, because what we have always wanted to know when tragedy strikes is why. And I found that comment about finger pointing particularly relevant, because we ask those questions. We ask the whys, and we want to point our finger at a particular cause. She goes on more simply to say, suffering invites us to be radically human with one another. We can't necessarily hide behind the theologies, because there isn't a tidy, succinct theological answer to these questions. The longer version of her answer might be a little difficult in the back to read. She says, God is impossibly loving. He loves us. He loves our families. He loves creation. God restores all things. All of history points to a God who makes sad things right. God doesn't tempt, abuse, endorse wickedness, abandon, or hate. In our darkest moment, when we are crushed, Jesus is as close as our own breath. He has given us to one another as agents of love and grace and safety. He told us hundreds of times to comfort each other, making sure we are cared for. Jesus wept over death and grief. Shed your tears, friend. We have a Savior who cries. And my favorite one is the final one. It's not the body's responsibility to explain why. We're family. We circle the wagons. We make casseroles. We weep with those who weep. But in the midst of the casserole analogy, it shares what the role of the church ought to be. It's not to sit around and ponder questions the theological mysteries, but to just be present with one another. And in that presence, I think that leads more to the answer to the question than what we find in our books of theology. This quote from Jason Tippett's, some of you may recognize his name. His wife Kara has blogged for a number of years, more recently about her battle with cancer, and she passed away yesterday. So his comments, this is from several weeks ago, but seem particularly relevant. He said, there are things in life that are simple, things you can do without thought. Empty the dishwasher, done. Fill each car with gas, boom. Make a meal, ow. But when a person you love is fading, nothing is simple. And so we find ourselves lost in that complexity, and that seems to be the place where it's most significant for the church to enter in and bring the casserole. Corrie ten Boom says no matter how deep our darkness is, he is deeper still. And Corrie ten Boom always has those amazing phrases to offer. We can argue that Jesus spent a lot of time praying, and in this case, God didn't necessarily change the plan because of Jesus' prayer. He spent the night praying before he chose his disciples, and he ended up with Judas. He also spent the night praying before he was arrested to be crucified. So couldn't Jesus claim that God wasn't listening to his prayers and abandoned his faith because of the suffering that was experienced in both of those situations? But thankfully, Jesus knew that prayer served a different role in these contexts, and that these incidents were part of a much larger and more significant story. So for our final scripture, 1 Corinthians 13 reminds us that we see only a reflection, and then we shall know face to face. Now I know in part, that I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So on this side of heaven, it's probably not supposed to make sense. And we simply have the role of the church and how that body can function together. So I'm going to tag team up to Nate to talk a little more about that.
It's good. Lots of good stuff in there for sure. I think that if we play with some of these quotes and ideas, then certainly suffering is valuable, but we may actually need it. One of my favorite thinkers, Dallas Willard, he was once asked, where is God's address? Where do you find God? He said, quite simply, it's at the end of your road. There's something about being at the end of our road, that being in suffering, whether it be ours or someone else's, we see it echoed through the scriptures and also through people. This idea of submission, that in suffering we let go. We quit trying to control. We quit trying to manage, and we submit. And that's probably one of the most helpful metaphors of the Christian life, is that is a life of submission. And so what does it look like then to submit to suffering? Not only ours, but suffering within the world. Don't quite know. It's very countercultural. We live in a society with incredible technological advancements and mechanisms to relieve suffering. It's probably good. But what it's done is that it's worked its way within us in such a sense that when suffering comes, we immediately look for the cure. I have a headache, and I immediately look to take something to relieve it. So what does it look like then to pause? My head hurts. How can that be my teacher today? I can't control other people. I can't control circumstances in life. What can I learn in that? And how can that propel me deeper into the bosom of God? I love the Psalms. I love their raw honesty. I mean, some of those prayers are prayers I don't think I could pray. But you notice a pattern, and I actually find this so helpful, that in the suffering, in the crying out of the suffering, there's always some sort of resolution. Maybe nothing's changed. And it's not tidy in a traditional Disney sense. But there's always this movement of crying out, of being in the suffering, and then of submission, of letting go. A movement towards trust. It's really quite beautiful. But culturally, we have to fight much there. It's very much a part of who we are as a people. To not look to suffering to be a teacher, to not look to suffering to move us deeper with God, but to immediately leave it. I'm into trees. I really like trees. And trees have a lot to teach us. And I was thinking of 3 different trees and how suffering, lessons of suffering in trees. The old writers talked about nature as the second great book, meaning the Bible's primary book we read to learn about God. Nature is the second great book. I kind of reverse them personally. I read the book of nature before I read the Bible. Probably read the book of nature more than I do the Bible. But anyway, the second great book. Trees. 3 lessons from trees. And the first one is sequoia trees. Have you seen these trees? Giant, huge trees. 2,000-year-old trees. It's quite spectacular if you've ever seen any of sequoia trees. They had a problem with sequoia trees in the 1800s, is that they realized no new ones were sprouting up. And they were trying to preserve this. A good 90% of the old wood forest in the Northwest was completely taken out in the late 1800s. And they realized nothing new was springing up. The reason is they were stopping fires. Fire would sweep through the land, and they would, to preserve and protect these trees, they would stop the fires as best they could. And what they came to learn is that the fires were not only good, they were absolutely necessary. That within the sequoia trees, their seeds remained trapped. And the only way they could be released was through fire. And so if you go and look at the giant sequoia trees, you can tell the markings of fire through the years. And it's in those times that these seedlings are birthed. And I think that's very much helpful for us. That in the times of fire, the potential for something to be released is significant. It's a little bit of a cliche, but a helpful one. In suffering will either become better or bitter. I don't think we have much of a choice for anything else. It's either going to take us further, deeper, into forming something quite beautiful within us, or we'll become angry, bitter, resentful. Quiet trees. The other example from trees that I find very helpful in suffering, and that is in a storm. You notice when we have a big storm, a windstorm come through, trees will often be overturned, uprooted. Trees that are uprooted, the ones that die, are the stiff trees. The trees that when the wind comes, they don't flex. They fight it. Man, tears them down. The trees that survive are the trees that flex, that move, and when the wind comes, they flow with it. They submit. I think that's a very helpful example for me, that when suffering comes, and it does come, sometimes quite frequently, what does it look like to flex and to flow with it, to not fight it, to let go? I had a really interesting experience a few years ago. I had this problem with, I get the stomach flu like once or twice a year, and I very much hate vomiting. But I was working with this idea of suffering. I was working with this idea of befriending pain, not fighting, being like the tree, glowing. So as I felt myself about to vomit, rather than stuff it down, rather than fight it, I thought I'll just submit to it. It's my body's way of cleaning it up, trying to get rid of something. And so I had this wonderful experience, and I say that quite seriously, of being up all night, growing up, accepting it, not fighting it, accepting it. It sounds gross, I'm sorry. Letting it be my teacher is really quite helpful. Changed a number of things for me. And the third example I'll give from trees is that of aspen trees. So if you look at a grove of aspens, in Colorado we have a lot of aspen trees, you never saw one aspen tree. The aspen trees' their roots are all intertwined, they're all together. Really, it's just one tree. Now this can be very problematic because when one becomes sick, they all become sick. One tree. They're all connected. Oh, and I find that so helpful for us. We are connected in many, many ways. My suffering is your suffering. Your suffering is mine. I've become quite amazed at how frequently people shy from others' suffering. How alone we are in our suffering. Almost a cliche, I think. It's the Jen Hatmaker quote, we circle the wagons, we cook meals, we come together. That's the way it's meant. God creates wonderful opportunities for us as a society when our brothers and sisters suffer. However, to face your suffering, I have to face my own suffering. To face your suffering, I have to face that I have no control. And there's very, very little I can do. And so we hide from one another. It's insult to injury of sorts. People, loneliest people in our society are often those who are suffering alone. What a wonderful opportunity for us. If we can learn to embrace our own suffering, learn to befriend suffering, learn to see it as a mechanism to help deepen my soul, then I can see your suffering as such too. And I can learn to be with you and not fix you. I can learn to hear your story. I can learn to be present. And like the aspen trees, we see how utterly connected we are. And there's a cost to that. There's a cost to being with other people in their suffering. And it hurts. Sometimes it damages us. There's even a term for it in social work. Secondary trauma. You enter into someone else's suffering, you hear their stories, it messes with us. I think in terms of that as a way that we take up our cross. It's a way of following Jesus by entering into others' suffering. Now, if I enter in free will, I enter into something I'm choosing to do, that I'm not victimized by that. For some reason or another, God has made us relational beings, woven us into community. We need each other, whether we want to need each other or not. But something happens in relational exchanges. Relationships heal. God's very intent on using relationships to bring healing to each other. And so my suffering of other people becomes a way for me to help be a part of God's process of healing. Hospice workers, the most beautiful people I've ever met. People who aren't afraid of others' suffering. People who have learned to embrace their own suffering and its redemptive possibilities. But this goes quite deep because there's lots of suffering in the world. It's easy for us to live in utter ignorance to that. Start looking at global issues. It can drown us, quite honestly. The suffering of the world, the suffering that happens to produce all the goods that we enjoy today. You don't have to go very far around the world to see some horrendous suffering. I don't think we need to shy away from that, hide from that. So I'm stuck with this idea, and I'll leave with this. We can give a little time for your interactions. But I've been trying to reframe suffering in the last few years. So if in fact we are eternal beings that will never cease to be, if in fact in 10,000 years we will have a conversation about this very moment, if in 100,000 years we still do not cease to be, if in fact this is true, then our 80-odd years here on earth, it's like that. It's a flash. It's a blink of an eye. However, it feels like a very important blink. But in the grand scope of eternity, our suffering is that. But it's an important that. It has wonderful potential. So, anyway, there's some musings, some ideas. But your thoughts, please interact with us and help Laura and I to work with this topic.
This is just a comment on something you said about people are not repelled by it, but they don't want to face up to suffering. And when my husband had a stroke, most of his friends have left him. They don't know how to talk to him because he can't respond. So it just his best friend. So then it starts you thinking about who they really is friends. Stuck with them.
And I hate to say it, but I think that, did you guys hear Judy? Her husband's illness this last year, that some of his closest friends and best friends just disappeared. And I hate to say it, but that's kind of the norm. And I think it really says more about us that leave than the person suffering. We don't know how to be there, to be with them. And it's a skill of sorts, but it requires facing suffering ourselves. If we're dead set on ignoring suffering in our own lives, then we're of no use to anyone else. When probably the best thing he needs is a friend to just come over and, hey, here I am. Doesn't he say anything? Doesn't he give advice? Just watch TV. Still love you. Sometimes I get this wonderful picture of what would it be if we as a community were mature enough to hold each other's suffering. That's Christian community. Other thoughts? thinking about?
No, I think you summarized it well. It's a complex question, and I think we want to keep it intellectual, but I think it forces us to look very deeply into who we are and how we've navigated suffering ourselves. So I think you hit it head on.
There's a term that we would use in addiction work. So my background as an addiction counselor, and it's just a really wonderful term. It's 2 words: suffer well. And for most people, their capacity to work through, overcome all sorts of addiction is submission, let go, quit trying, willpower, which see this fits really well for suffering, and then suffer well. That when you let go of your addiction, you're going to suffer, and you're going to suffer considerably. But can you do so well? And can you be in that? And my work with people in recovery is just that. The ability to submit and let go, give space for God, to be present, and to suffer well. We need each other to teach each other how to do that. How to suffer well.
Any advice on how to help those who are not suffering well, but embracing bitterness?
Especially unbelievers.
Because it's a different ballgame. The end of the story is so different.
I think the difference is unbelievers don't have the concept of truth, absolute truth. I mean, everything's relative these days. And whereas with God, there is truth and there's false. It's more black and white. And although we can't see it because we're still looking through that glass darkly, we don't see the big picture, but that's what makes it, I think that's what's the difference. It's the fact that he understands, God understands where we are. We are that speck, and he's given us the freedom. And it's our freedoms, the reason we have our freedom is because of his love. And today's world misinterprets what love really is. Love is, giving me something, that's love, that's what today's society says. But in God's perspective, love is when he did give us that freedom, but he also gave us the way out, and that's something that is totally foreign to today's concept of love in our society. And I think that's where it gets difficult to...
Well, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
To me, the believer has that hope. We have God's promises to rely on, where someone who is not a believer, that's foreign to them.
I also think there's a lot of truth in what Jen Hatmaker said about the casseroles. I think sometimes the best way we can help an unbeliever navigate their suffering is to just keep making the casseroles. Keep showing up and keep responding in the way that our faith teaches us to show up, to be present, to be the one that would keep showing up to the rampies, bringing the casserole, despite what the response is, but just to keep making the casserole.
Yeah, and I think, if I can jump in, it's all right.
Yeah.
Presence is the primary gift, not our intellectual insight. If you go back to that Jen Hatmaker quote, she talks about how Job's friends, Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar, pointed the finger right at Job and said, "You are complicit at best, if not wholly responsible at worst, for your own suffering." They had done really well for 7 days when they sat with him in his suffering, silently present to him in that moment, suffering with compassion. It was when they opened their mouths and tried to share all their great theological insights that they had a problem. And God had a problem with it, because at the end of Job, God says, your friends didn't speak rightly of me. Right? And so I think that whether we're dealing with folks who are experiencing suffering from a Christian perspective or a non, presence is the primary gift we can offer. And I also think that, if you look in Scripture, whether people were in a great relationship with God or not, it didn't change the fact that their suffering felt like they were being forsaken by God. That's what Jesus claimed himself. Why have you forsaken me? And so, so the ultimate, the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann says that what God did in the crucifixion of Jesus was chose to willingly enter into the suffering of those who felt forsaken by God. And I think that's a great call for the church, to be willing to sit with those who are suffering, and when what they are experiencing feels like they are being totally abandoned by God. Just be present with them and to them.
No, it's really good, everybody here. And really the worst thing, maybe the thing not to do, is to offer these "I'll pray for you" pieces. Just go pray. My wife's father-in-law just passed away, and she got a number of these, "Well, I'm praying for you." And she just goes, "Damn it, call me. Come be my friend, Quit praying for me. That's not what I need right now. I need presence." The other thing that we can do, where we can get into trouble, and I think it's born out of our own discomfort with these lines of Jesus, "Why have you forsaken me?" is to offer false hope, or to just kind of throw happy verses that often are taken out of context. But to be in that mystery of it all really can be quite helpful for people. The thing I would say, John, is can I help someone see the possibility and opportunity in it? Because so often, though, when suffering comes, I just am looking for the way out. And I'm just, get through this. I want to feel good. And we have these horrible ideas that love is about me feeling good or me having my own way. Love calls something deeper in me, longs for something deeper in me that may not have anything to do with me feeling good. But possibility, opportunity, what can be birthed out of that and in this. And that's a long road. That isn't
I worked with a physical therapist a couple years ago here in Jackson who was Jewish, and so we had good conversations, and one morning she came in looking pretty ragged, and I asked her about that, and she said, there was a death in our congregation, and it's our practice to sit Shiva with one another, and so there's a prescribed number of days that the community gathers and just hangs out at the home where someone is grieving. And I believe the standard is 3 days, but the family can request additional days, which I thought was the coolest thing. And she said the family requested another day. And so we had to scramble a little bit, because in order for it to be authentic, they had to gather their quorum. It had to be such a significant portion of their congregation. And so she said it was a little bit last minute, and we had to get some food together. But for her, it was a non-negotiable. If the family asked for that presence, then they were going to be there. And there wasn't a lot of script to it. They showed up and they sat. I mean, it's called sitting Shiva. You just are there with the family. And so I think there's some helpful cues in that.
Well, that was Jesus' response to his own suffering. The Garden of Gethsemane. He went to his closest friends and, "Hey, will you guys stay up with me tonight?" What I love about that story is that they failed him. And then he confronted them. "Where are you guys? Come on. I need you tonight." But yeah, he asked to sit Shiva. Is that the word Shiva? I find great comfort in the book of Job, and towards the end. This is going to sound very strange, but maybe it'll make sense to you. In the very end, when God goes to respond, and that statement, forgive my paraphrase, where were you, little man, when I made the foundations of the earth? Where were you? It goes on. And it's a rebuke of sorts, but there's something that I find great comfort in my own suffering. When the darkness of night comes, to rest in that. I don't know. I don't have answers. And quite frankly, I don't need to. I can let go of that. And let this be my teacher. Reach out to others. And then be available to others. So it's incarnational. I don't have a clock, but I think our time is up. It feels like 2 minutes over. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.